Trust me, Muslims do not want you to see these three verses we're talking about today. And it's not hard to see why. Hidden in the Quran are three passages that, when compared to the earlier scriptures, the Kitab, they expose Islam as a false religion. These aren't obscure details or fringe interpretations. These are verses straight out of the Quran itself, and they are devastating. By the end of this video, you'll see exactly how these three verses dismantle Islam's claim to truth, why you need to learn them, memorize them, and have them ready for your next conversation with a Muslim. If you're new here, I'm Cameron Bertuzzi. This is Capturing Christianity, where we expose the truth of Christian belief. Before we get to the three verses, I need to introduce you to another one first. And this one is absolutely essential for what we're discussing today because it sets the stage for everything that we're going to cover. Okay, it's Surah 1094. Here's what it says. So, if you are in doubt, O Muhammad, about that which we have revealed to you, then ask those who have been reading the scripture before you. The truth has certainly come to you from your Lord, so never be among the doubters. Think about what this is saying. Muhammad himself, or the readers of the Quran, are told that if they have doubts about what's being revealed to them in the Quran, then they can go to the people who are reading the earlier scriptures, meaning Jews and Christians, and then use those scriptures to remove their doubts. But here's the key. If the previous scriptures can confirm the Quran, then they can also expose when the Quran gets something wrong. This cuts both ways. If the previous scriptures don't line up with the Quran, then according to Surah 1094, that should actually produce doubt about the Quran itself. And this isn't just me making things up, okay? There was a recent exchange between a Christian, Avery, and a Muslim apologist, Daniel. The Muslim flat out admitted that the previous scriptures can both remove doubts and produce doubts about the Quran. Let's watch this clip.
Coming here, if Muhammad is in doubt about the Quran, he's supposed to go ask those who've been reading the scripture before him. How will that help his doubt in the Quran?
I explained that. I told you how it helps to see the previous stories of the prophets.
Got it.
To read the stories of Moses or Jesus, or to see those stories. Yeah.
He's supposed to, it helps him by being able to go back and check the stories of the previous prophets to see that what's going on with him and what the Quran is saying is in line with the previous prophets. Is that correct?
You could say that.
All right. So if Muhammad sees that he's in line with the stories of the previous prophets and what happens to them and their journeys and what the Quran is saying, then he'll have no reason to doubt what the Quran is saying, right?
Yes.
Okay. That means the opposite is true. That if he checks and he sees that this doesn't match the stories of the prophets and what the Quran is saying is not in line with the stories of the prophets, then Muhammad would have a good reason to doubt what the Quran is saying and know the Quran is false, right?
If that were the case, yeah.
So there you have it. Daniel openly admits that the previous scriptures can remove doubts, but also that they can produce doubts. That's not my gloss of the situation. That's straight from his own words. Now, before we move forward, I need to clarify exactly how Daniel tries to limit what counts as scripture in Surah 1094. This is super important, so pay attention to this section. Earlier in their debate, when he was dealing with Surah 5:43 through 48, Daniel made a really big deal about what those verses mean. In those passages, Jews and Christians are told to judge by what Allah has revealed in their scriptures. Christians typically point to this as proof that the Quran actually affirms the authority of the Bible, but Daniel pushed back really hard. He insisted that those verses weren't about the entire body of scripture. They were only about legal rulings, things like stoning and eye for an eye. So in other words, he tried to confine those verses strictly to biblical law. But when the discussion, their debate, shifted to Surah 1094, he sort of pivoted. There, he no longer restricted it to the law. Instead, he said that that verse is about Muhammad looking at the written stories of the prophets for reassurance. And Daniel even mentioned names. He mentioned Moses and Jesus.
How will that help his doubt in the Quran?
I explained that. I told you how it helps to see the previous stories of the prophets.
Got it.
To read the stories of Moses or Jesus, or to see those stories. Yeah.
So notice what just happened. This is super important. He moves from limiting the scope to legal material in the Torah in Surah 5 to then expanding it to the stories of the prophets in Surah 1094, again, from the Old Testament. But importantly, this is still not the whole Bible that he thinks is in mind in 1094, but it is more than just law. Fine, let's actually, for the sake of argument, let's grant him that conclusion. Let's say that Surah 1094 is pointing us only to the written stories of the prophets in the Old Testament, the very scriptures Daniel himself brings into the picture. Even if that's all that we consider, the Quran still runs into serious problems, because when we actually line up its stories with those prophetic accounts from the Old Testament, the contradictions literally leap off the page. And that's precisely where we're headed next. We're going to test his claim in 3 places where the Quran and the Old Testament, the stories of the prophets, directly collide: Abraham's father, Noah's sons, and the golden calf. Each case shows how, even on Daniel's narrowed terms, Surah 1094 backfires. The very scriptures he points us to don't remove doubts about the Quran. They produce them. Let's start with the first and most straightforward example, Abraham's father. You know, speaking of doubts, one thing I don't want to be in doubt about is about whether I can keep making videos like this on my channel. Here's the deal. Work like this takes a ton of research in editing and, frankly, endurance. If you've found these arguments helpful and want to see more content that holds up under scrutiny, consider joining me on Patreon. Not only does your support remove my doubts about being able to keep this channel going, it also gives you access to exclusive perks and behind-the-scenes updates. So if you would like to help expose Islam's inconsistencies while also strengthening the case for Christianity, head over to my Patreon. The link is down below. All right, back to our first example, Abraham's father. Our first Quran verse is one you'll definitely want to memorize because it's short, it's simple, and absolutely devastating. The Quran says in Surah 674, when Abraham said to his father, Azar, do you take idols as gods? Indeed, I see you and your people in manifest error. Okay, lock that in. Surah 674. Abraham's father's name, according to the Quran, is Azar. Now compare that to the written story about the prophet Abraham. Genesis 11:26 through 27 says this. Now these are the records of the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram. There's no ambiguity here. Okay, the Torah is very clear about this. Abraham's father was named Terah. So then which is it? Is it Terah or Azar? They can't both be right. Okay, and remember, Daniel has already conceded that the stories of the prophets count as part of the scripture in Surah 1094. That means this contradiction falls directly into the Quran's own test case. Now, Muslims have tried to patch up this inconsistency a few different ways. Some say Azar was a nickname, maybe a title like an idolater or old man. Others say Azar was actually Abraham's uncle, not his real father, and the Quran just used father loosely. And of course, the most common move is to say that the Torah is corrupted. There's just one small problem. None of these explanations actually hold up under scrutiny. The nickname theory is pure speculation. There's no evidence in the Bible, the Quran, or in history that Terah was ever called Azar. The uncle theory directly conflicts with the Quran itself, which consistently calls Azar Abraham's father in the literal sense. In claiming that the Torah was corrupted is a complete non-starter because the name Terah appears in every manuscript tradition that we have, including the Dead Sea Scrolls, which predate Islam by centuries. So, according to Surah 1094, what should we conclude on this basis? That the Quran actually contradicts the previous stories of the prophets on a basic historical detail, and that should actually produce doubt about the Quran itself. Next up, did you know that the Quran says that one of Noah's sons died in the flood? Yes, let's go ahead and go there. The second verse you'll want to commit to memory comes from Surah 11:42 through 43. It says this, "And it sailed with them through waves like mountains, and Noah called to his son who was apart, 'O my son, come aboard with us and be not with the disbelievers.' He said, I will take refuge on a mountain to protect me from the water. Noah said, there is no protector today from the decree of Allah except for whom he gives mercy. And the waves came between them, and he was among the drowned. Now memorize that, okay? Surah 11:42 through 43. According to the Quran, one of Noah's sons refused to get on the ark and drowned. But the previous scriptures paint a very different picture. Genesis 7:13 says, on the very same day, Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them entered the ark. Then Genesis 9:18 through 19 says, the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and from these the whole earth was populated. So in other words, all of Noah's sons survived the flood. So which is it? Did all 3 sons survive, or did one drown? Muslims have again tried to patch this up. Some claim that Noah had a 4th son, often called Canaan or Yam, who wasn't mentioned in the Bible but was then lost in the flood somehow. Others argue that Genesis only lists the sons who were going on to repopulate the earth, leaving out the one who died childless. Here's the problem. Again, there's 0 evidence for a 4th son. Every manuscript tradition of Genesis, including the Dead Sea Scrolls from centuries before Islam, names only 3 sons. And if the Bible supposedly omitted this story, why is there no trace of it in Jewish tradition? No variant manuscripts, nothing in the vast flood legends of the ancient Near East. The Quran is the first place where this detail shows up. So what's more likely, that every Jewish and Christian community worldwide somehow conspired to erase this extra son, or that the Quran simply got the story wrong? According to its own test in 1094, the previous stories of the prophets should remove doubt or produce doubt. And in this case, it produces more doubt. And we're not done. Okay, the golden calf story is up next, and it's much, much worse. The third verse or set of verses that you need to lock in is Surah 20, verses 85 through 88. Here's what it says. Allah said, but indeed, we have tried your people after you departed, and the Samiri has led them astray. And he, the Samiri, extracted for them the statue of a calf which had a lowing sound. And they said, this is your God and the God of Moses. But he forgot. Memorize that. Again, Surah 20, 85 through 88. According to the Quran, when Moses went up to Mount Sinai, it wasn't Aaron who made the golden calf. It was a mysterious figure called the Samiri, literally the Samaritan. But in the previous scriptures, Exodus 32 couldn't be any clearer. Verse 4, and he, who in context is Aaron, received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. So Aaron, Moses' own brother, was the one who fashioned the idol. So what's going on here? Well, the Quran swaps out Aaron for a Samaritan. There's just one small problem. The Samaritans didn't exist until centuries later, after the Assyrian exile and the founding of Samaria around 880 BC. That's hundreds of years after Moses. It's like claiming George Washington fought the Nazis. It's a glaring anachronism that every serious scholar can see. Muslims, of course, just like the previous verses, they've tried to rescue this. Some argue that Samiri wasn't a Samaritan at all. It was just a personal nickname or for some Israelite troublemaker. Others spin up theories about a lost tribe called Samira, and still others say the Quran is correcting the Bible because prophets can't commit sins like idolatry, so Aaron must be innocent. But again, all of these explanations collapse under scrutiny. There's 0 evidence for a tribe of Samira, no ancient source mentioning an alternative culprit, and the Quran itself offers no clarification. As for defending Aaron's honor, sorry, but the Bible has no problem at all showing the sins of its heroes. Moses lost his temper. David committed adultery. Peter denied Christ. The honesty of the Bible makes it ring true. These are ordinary people. The Quran, on the other hand, looks like it's sanitizing the story to save Aaron's reputation, and in doing so, it introduces a howler of an anachronism. According to Surah 1094, when we compare the previous scriptures to the Quran, we should either find reassurance or find reason to doubt. And when the Torah says Aaron made the calf, but the Quran says a Samaritan did, that's not reassurance. Okay, that's doubt, and it's devastating. All right, let's tie all of this together and see where we land on this. We've now looked at 3 contradictions between the Quran and the Old Testament prophetic stories, and this forces us to confront the dilemma that Surah 1094 lays at Muhammad's feet. The verse itself insists that if he is in doubt, he should consult those who have been reading the previous scriptures. If those scriptures are reliable, then Muhammad should have no doubt, except what happens when those very scriptures contradict what he's preaching? That's exactly the situation we've just seen with Abraham's father, with Noah's son, and the golden calf example. On Daniel's own interpretation of 1094, the prophetic stories of the Old Testament don't remove doubts about the Quran, they produce them. This puts Islam in a very tight corner. There are really only 2 horns of the dilemma. This is sometimes called the Islamic dilemma. Horn 1, the prophetic stories in the Old Testament are reliable. If that's true, then the Quran is false because it directly contradicts them. Horn 2, the prophetic stories are unreliable, but in that case, Surah 1094 is literally incoherent. The verse directs Muhammad to consult stories that can't be trusted. That would mean God himself is pointing his prophet to corrupted sources as a way of resolving doubts, and that makes absolutely no sense. Now, this is where Muslim apologists will often try to slip in a sort of third option, corruption. They'll say, well, the previous scriptures have been changed and corrupted. But remember Daniel's own concession. He admitted that the stories of the prophets can either remove doubt or produce doubt.
If that were the case, yeah.
In other words, he accepts that these stories have enough reliability to function as evidence. He can't then turn away and say that they're completely corrupt. That would erase the very foundation he built his interpretation on. He'd be sawing off the branch he's sitting on. So his only real option is to advance what we might call the selective corruption hypothesis. That is, the Old Testament prophetic stories are trustworthy in places where they line up with the Quran, but corrupted in all the places where they don't. That way, Muhammad can still be reassured by the true parts and dismiss the false parts whenever there's a clash. Now, personally, I'm actually really happy for Muslims to be in this situation, or at least to forward this hypothesis, because of the intellectual costs. The selective corruption hypothesis is intellectually disastrous for at least 3 reasons. I'm going to go over them now. First, it's unevidenced. Okay, if you're going to say that specific passages of the Bible are corrupt, you need independent historical reasons for thinking so, reasons apart from the Quran itself. But there is no manuscript evidence, no patristic commentary, no archaeological find suggesting that Abraham's father was ever called Azar in Jewish tradition, or that Noah lost a son in the flood, or that the Samaritans existed in the time of Moses. The textual evidence we do have, Hebrew, Greek, Samaritan Pentateuch, Dead Sea Scrolls, all affirm the very details that contradict the Quran. Selective corruption isn't just improbable, it's completely without historical warrant. Secondly, it's unfalsifiable. Okay, if every time that the Quran disagrees with the Bible, you can just say corruption, then there's no possible way to actually test the Quran's claims. Any counterexample, no matter how strong, can just be brushed aside with a hand wave. That's not a defense, okay? That's immunizing your view against evidence. And once you do that, you've abandoned rational argument altogether. Third, and probably most importantly, it's circular. Okay, the logic kind of goes like this. The Quran is true. Therefore, if the Bible contradicts it, that part must be false. Therefore, the Quran is true. That's not a rational argument, okay? It's a closed loop. You've already assumed what you set out to prove. And to make matters worse, this circle flies directly in the face of Surah 1094 itself. The verse tells Muhammad to resolve doubt by looking to earlier scripture. But if you're going to assume in advance that anything which disagrees is corrupt, then you can't possibly use scripture to remove doubts. You've gutted the verse of its entire point. So let's sort of take a step back and take stock. Okay, we've looked at 3 passages, well, really 4, and when we hold them up in the light of the Old Testament, the results are absolutely devastating. The Quran tells Muhammad to seek confirmation from the earlier scriptures, but those scriptures actually undermine the Quran's authority. The only way out is to claim selective corruption, but that view is unevidenced, it's unfalsifiable, and circular. In short, it's not a lifeline, it's a rational dead end. And notice what makes this especially powerful. Okay, we're not setting up straw men or relying on obscure sources. We're using the exact standards and admissions of a popular Muslim apologist with nearly 500,000 subscribers. He himself, Daniel, admitted that the previous scriptures can both remove doubt and produce doubt. He himself said that Surah 1094 is referring to the written stories of the prophets, Moses, Jesus, and others. We simply took him at his word, lined up the Quran with those stories, and the contradictions literally leapt off the page. That's why these verses expose Islam as false, not because we forced them into a dilemma, but because their own text and their own defenders did that for us. So learn these verses, memorize them, use them. Oh, and by the way, Christianity is true.